welcome to today's Crossing Borders broadcast. Before we start, as usual, I want to thank each and every one of you who joined us yesterday or on any previous broadcasts we've had. Those broadcasts are available on our YouTube channel, so remember to hit subscribe and search for Investment Migration Council on YouTube, and you can also follow us on our LinkedIn and Twitter. Remember, today you can ask questions in the GoToWebinar widget, which is in the right of your screen. There's nearly 100 of you with us today, so we will try and get through as many questions as possible. And to keep you engaged, as ever, we will have a couple of polls. And I'm going to kick off with the first poll. We are interested to see where everybody is from and joining us today. So where are you guys from today? Let's launch that poll. Okay, we're still collecting responses, so please get clicking. We are interested. It does help our speakers to tailor-make their presentations a little bit. All right, I'm going to close that off and share the results with you. So you can see 33% of you are in the Americas. Equal weighting with Europe and Africa, and then followed by the Middle East. And trading a little bit behind is the Asia Pacific region. So let me close that back off. I'm going to share my screen with you guys so that you can see. And just briefly, we had a few technical problems. I want to try and bring in Chad Ellsworth, who should be able to chat with us. Chad, if you're there, maybe you can unmute yourself from your computer. And I want to add you as a panelist. So while Chad plays around with the technicalities,
Bruno, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well, Chad. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem at all. So we can't see you, but we can hear you very clearly. So look, let's kick off. And today's broadcast is talking about strategies in the age of COVID-19 and global pandemics. And clearly, entrepreneurs and investors are increasingly looking to leverage US and other global entrepreneurial and investor migration programs as an insurance policy, and to diversify their business opportunities and, of course, their residency during this world economic downturn, or certainly the global recession that is highly likely to be around the corner. So as the economic opportunity continues to contract globally, many governments are still interested in attracting the best and the brightest of the global talent pool in furtherance of their economic development, and of course to create jobs, which is a big thing. We talked in a lot of detail yesterday with our EP5 panel, and of course EP5 was created as a job creation program, principally for urban and particularly non-urban areas. I'm joined today by Chad Ellsworth, who's a member of the Investment Migration Council, and he's a partner at Fragomen Worldwide, based in New York. And it's always a pleasure to have somebody from the team of Fragomen with us on one of these broadcasts. Of course, you would know that Nadine Goldfoot, your colleague based in London, sits on the IMC's governing board. So a very good afternoon to you, Chad. How are things in New York for you this morning?
Thank you. I'm I think week 8 of quarantine, so it's probably a good thing that your audience can't see me. But everyone is safe and healthy in the Fragomen family, and thank you for asking.
That's fantastic. Chad, a lot to talk about, but I want to start before your presentation. I just want to get your perspective, and I'm asking all my American friends and colleagues this question, is how is the current US administration, or what is the view of the current US administration on these investor programs, given the recent presidential proclamation by Donald Trump to close down all immigration to the United States? So what's your perspective on that, and how has Fragomen responded to this proclamation, which has caused a lot of ripples around the world, we have to say?
So the picture is a bit mixed with this administration in terms of what some of the rhetoric and publicly stated policies or tweets have been, and then what the actual practical implementation of these policies look like. So the Trump administration is still overall inclined to support business immigration, and particularly people with advanced skills. So there's an overall desire through eventual legislation to reorient the US immigration system away from a primarily family-based system, an ability to bring extended family members from abroad, and really focus it on skills and employment, and particularly those skills that are not widely available in the domestic labor market. Many of those changes will require legislation, which we think is unlikely in this Congress, probably until after the next presidential election. But despite some of the rhetoric, there are still programs and bipartisan support for many of the investor and entrepreneurial programs that the IMC and many of your members are interested in. So I'll cover it more fully in my slides, but as an example, there was a presidential proclamation that it was initially stated that it would ban all immigration to the United States for a temporary period. In practice, the way it was implemented, it was a ban for about a 60-day period, only for those persons that were abroad waiting to immigrant visa process. So again, mostly family members waiting to join immediate relatives in the United States, but there were exemptions for our investors. So for instance, if you were an EB-5 applicant and you were waiting to immigrant visa process abroad, you were not subject to the ban. And I think that speaks to the Trump administration's acknowledgement and bipartisan acknowledgement that the immigration system can be used to achieve economic objectives and specifically job creation in this instance. So some of the rhetoric hasn't matched the practical implementation of these policies, but there still seems to be an inclination to support some of these investor and entrepreneurial programs.
Right, interesting. I think what's really interesting what you said is you're starting to have this conversation about the skills-based, potentially points-based immigration, like there is in the United States. And we know that also Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, is talking about that. Once the post-Brexit trade talks are completed with the European Union. So clearly, as you pointed out, that's not going to happen this side of the administration's term. But is that something that the Democrats are also looking at, talking about, in case there is a Democratic win in November?
So the last time that the Democrats were in charge of immigration policy, was really under the Obama administration, when there was a push to do comprehensive immigration reform. And in that bill, which was passed by the Senate, it never passed the House of Representatives, there was some reorienting of the immigration system. So for instance, I believe there was the elimination of the category that allowed US citizens to bring in their adult brothers and sisters. And there were additional visa numbers that were provided to the employment-based and some of the other high-skilled categories. I don't have the most recent family-based statistics, but it's about 750,000 visa numbers available, and there's only 120,000 visas available in the employment-based categories. So it's currently very lopsided in terms of heavily favored towards the family-based system. And the Democrats did seem, at least under the Obama administration, to in some ways balance that out through the elimination of certain family-based categories. But it's really an open question in this environment if there will still be that same sort of bipartisan consensus for maybe a more balanced approach between the two immigration streams.
So definitely something to follow in the next few weeks and months as we head into past the primaries and into the real election in November. All right, Chad, I don't want to delay this session. So I want to hand over the floor to you, because I know you've got a super interesting presentation with some strong visual slides to illustrate your talking points. So let's see if you can. Do you see that you can control the presentation from your end?
I don't believe I can. So if it's okay with you, I might have you just to transfer to the agenda slide. Do you mind controlling it for me? And I'll kind of
let's get that organized. How's that looking?
Looking good, looking good. So right here, we're on the agenda slide. Really what I wanted to do is cover what is the current COVID-19 impact to many of the immigration systems around the world. And many of these measures are temporary in nature, although some of the, many of them have an indefinite expiration date, obviously, depending on how the pandemic plays out. Interestingly, and I think we'll see, that there were a lot of carve-outs for these travel exemptions, particularly for people that had residence in the jurisdiction that they were trying to travel to, or a more formal work permit. So one of the things that I think is interesting for this audience is that economic citizenship and residency has always been a type of insurance policy for many of the individuals that leverage these programs. And I think that will be particularly true and have a new sense of urgency when we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, given many of the exemptions that advantage residents and formal visa holders, even with the temporary travel ban. So I think that's interesting. As we discussed briefly, I'll cover some of the specifics of the US administration and the presidential orders and the impact on immigration. As I mentioned, there were carve-outs that advantage investors in the process. So I think it speaks to some of the bipartisan consensus around some of these economic citizenship and residency programs and their value to the US economy. That is particularly true in an economic downturn where obviously loss of jobs and job creation is front and center. There are, I will then cover sort of what are the main US entrepreneurial and investor visa options in the United States, even despite these current travel bans. I'll talk about some of the permanent options, green card options. I know you've covered EB-5 previously, so we won't spend much time on that. And then I did want to review some of the key global entrepreneurial and investor options that are available in some of the other major jurisdictions. So you mentioned my partner, Dane Goldfoot, who sits in London, is busy in the UK right now, not only helping investors and entrepreneurs get into the UK, but those people who were in the European Union and might not have access to the UK post-Brexit. And of course, we're all looking at the January 2021 exit date and keeping that in mind. And then finally, we'll look at Australia as well. If you don't mind, just pivoting quickly to slide 4. As I mentioned, I'm a partner at Fragomen. I sit in the New York office. One of the reasons that I enjoy working at Fragomen is really our ability to provide holistic immigration advice. We do immigration services into over 170 countries worldwide. So many of these investors and entrepreneurs have multiple immigration needs. Even within their immediate family, they might have different immigration issues going on. So for instance, a child studying in the UK, another living in the US. So the ability really to holistically look across the globe and analyze these tax issues, residency issues, eligibility issues is going to be important, particularly if there are multiple immigration needs. So if you don't mind just pivoting to a sample of the COVID temporary travel restrictions, it starts on slide 6. In terms of Australia during the COVID pandemic, we are seeing, sorry, slide 7, we are seeing a ban for all non-citizens and non-residents. So there is an exemption for permanent residents, direct family members of permanent residents and US citizens, or New Zealand citizens who are residents of Australia. And there are a few other exemptions available for people trying to get into Australia. But as you can see, it was really important if you had residency in Australia in terms of your ability to enter and exit the country. One of the interesting things about Australia and New Zealand that we're currently tracking is this concept of a travel bubble. So you may have read in the news that Australia and New Zealand are thinking of essentially creating a travel bubble that would allow citizens or people within both jurisdictions to travel freely and exclude others during the COVID pandemic. I think we could see some more of those type of regional agreements. I'll mention in later slides, the US, Canada, and Mexico have been coordinating some border issues as it relates to North America, and certainly there in the EU, you have a lot of coordination. But these sort of regional bubbles, regional approaches to bans and entry, I think we could be seeing a lot more of that, and Australia and New Zealand are at the forefront. Next slide. Mainland China obviously was the first country to experience the COVID pandemic. They seem to be the first jurisdiction that is emerging from the post pandemic crisis in terms of opening up. China had entry is only allowed for Chinese citizens, permanent residents of mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. They have very strict quarantine rules, only able to enter through certain airports. And then, only visa holders that were issued on or before March 28th were honored, and others were either required to wait outside of the country or reapply. So again, residency and the more formal work permits were very important to conducting business in China. Singapore had an entry and transit ban for all short-term visitors anywhere in the world. There were issued stay-at-home orders for 14 days, so pretty strict quarantine requirements. Again, there were exemptions for residents and people with longer term visas. So it was very important what immigration status you held in Singapore in terms of your ability to enter and exit the country, and that continues to be the case. And then finally, the UK and the United States. Next slide. The UK doesn't have an official ban on any on international arrivals. There is a 14-day self-quarantine period. There are exemptions for people that are coming from France, Ireland, and the Channel Islands. The UK government has been very innovative in terms of the concessions that they've made to immigrants living in the country, in terms of extending their status, allowing them to remain in the UK if they can't travel to their home country because of COVID, but otherwise there is no official ban. The United States really had a rolling ban. It started with mainland China and Iran, specifically people having to quarantine if they had been to those countries for 14 days. It was eventually rolled out to the Schengen zone. So if you had been in the Schengen zone within the last 14 days for entry, there was an automatic quarantine or ban, and then quarantine. And then essentially the US has a system where there were many exemptions for permanent residents, family members of US citizens or LPRs, and the type of visa or the residence that you held was very important in terms of your ability to come in and out of the United States, and still is. So I think many of the trends that we see in the United States and some of these major jurisdictions are really happening all over the world. But as you can see, residence is very important in terms of an exemption. Pivoting away from the current travel bans, we touched on this earlier. As I stated, if you just could turn the slide quickly, the Trump administration issued a tweet initially saying that there was going to be a suspension of all immigration to the United States because of COVID. It caused a bit of a panic in the news, as well as amongst many of our clients. When the actual order came out, it was more narrow in scope, and it really only applied to people that were abroad waiting to come into the country as permanent residents. We call that immigrant visa processing, with also various exceptions. And the most notable one for this audience is EB-5 applicants, which is the permanent investor program in the United States. They were exempted from these restrictions. So again, I think it speaks to the importance, or at least the administration's view of the importance of the EB-5 program, particularly to economic development and getting the best and brightest of the world talent into the United States. It also did not affect those persons who were living in the United States and seeking a green card in the United States through adjustment of status. One of the things, if you don't mind switching to the next slide, that I did want to flag for the audience is, even though it was limited in scope and there were exemptions for investors, the proclamation that Trump issued did direct the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Labor to study the impact on temporary foreign workers, or the temporary foreign worker programs, with a view of potentially issuing further restrictions in these areas by executive order or presidential proclamation. And the two ways that the administration would do that is really leveraging the public health provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act, as well as some pretty broad provisions that allow the president or executive branch to exclude the admission of persons who are not in the national interest of the United States. So it's a fairly broad use of some existing powers under current law. Some of the things that are being contemplated, and this is only through informal fact gathering, are potential restrictions on seasonal workers, labor market attestations potentially for H-1B workers, which is the customary professional visa in the United States, as well as potential labor market test requirements on F1 students who are seeking optional practical training. I think what's interesting for this audience in terms of how the administration is thinking, and we've seen this trend even prior to COVID, But many of the global talent who is looking to either study or live in the United States are going to continue to seek potentially to bypass some of these temporary non-immigrant visa programs, so a student visa or the regular H-1B visa, and essentially go straight to permanent residence through EB-5 or potentially some other matter, because there are benefits to having residence, and there could be further restriction and more of the traditional avenues that people use to come to the United States. So for instance, getting an F1 visa, getting an H1 visa, and having your employer sponsor you for permanent residence. So I think those trends will continue, and we'll see, at least in the United States, more interest in the permanent residence programs, and particularly EB-5. Pivoting to then away from the policy, what are the temporary US temporary visa strategies that are still open for investors? One of the main ones that my clients use, and it's not available to every nationality, is what's called the E1, E2 treaty trader or investor program. And the concept here is that the United States has various bilateral treaties with countries around the world. So they don't have one with every country, and we'll list them here in the presentation. But if there's an underlying treaty with the sending jurisdiction, and there is a company in the United States that is wholly owned by a national of that sending country, so there's an E treaty with the UK, and if there's a UK company that's opening in the United States, either because it's traded on the UK stock exchange or because it's majority owned by UK foreign nationals, then it would allow that company to register either the trading arrangement or the investor arrangement with the consulate in the sending country. So there's no immigration service involved. It allows you to register directly with the consulate in the UK and send people to the United States on an e-visa, as long as they are British or have the nationality of the sending country, and are coming to the United States in a managerial or what's called an essential skills capacity. The nice thing about the e-visa is that it's available for a 5-year period, and it can be extended indefinitely. So as long as you continue to work for that UK company in the United States, we have people on an e-visa for 20+ years. You can get a green card, so you're not necessarily precluded in the future from getting a green card. But many of my clients like the e-visa because they can stay on a temporary visa without getting a green card or citizenship for many years, which has a downstream impact in terms of where your residence is, where your tax obligations lie, and not everyone wants a green card. The concept, though, is that the company, if it's an E1, is engaged in substantial cross-border trade, and if it's an E2, that there's a substantial investment coming from the UK or whatever the sending country is into the United States in terms of opening a business or investing in a business. Turning to the slide, the next slide, these are the APAC countries with E1, E2 treaties. So Australia, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, some of the major Asian, Singapore jurisdictions that regularly use this category. Next slide are, the next couple slides actually are the EMEA countries with E1, E2 treaties. So I mentioned the UK, France, Germany, Australia. If you could just pivot to the next 2 slides that list EMEA, Ireland, Israel. So there are many, many countries with these treaties. And then the final slide are the Americas countries, Mexico and Canada being the big countries. I know in the past we've talked about Grenada having an E2 treaty that allows sometimes Chinese citizens to get Grenada citizenship and then leverage the E2 program. But what's nice about the E2 in this current environment is, again, it's administered by the State Department. It's adjudicated by the consulates worldwide. And as these consulates start to reopen, there are dedicated E-treaty officers in each consulate to review these petitions and approve them. So we're typically see approvals in as quick as 2 to 3 months. Obviously, that will be a little delayed in the current environment, as there's been a backlog given consulate closures over the last 60 days. But it's nevertheless a pretty fast way for entrepreneurs and investors to get into the United States. If you could go to the next slide. Again, I mentioned this, but common issues with the treaty investor is that your business needs to be 50% more than 50% of international trade. Trade includes many things: goods, services, international banking, and then trade needs to be substantial, and that will really pivot on the type of business. There's no minimum requirement there. And then when you pivot to the next slide, you can see that the E2, which is much more common with my client base than the E1, what's great about it is that there's no minimum investment threshold necessarily. They use a proportionality test depending on the type of business that you're investing in. So I have, art galleries that have been opened in New York that are wholly British owned or French owned. With much lower investment amounts than what would be required by EB5 or some of these other global investor programs. So it really just depends on the type of business and the business plan, but there's a lot of discretion there from the government to issue these. What the government's really concerned about these visas is that they're not, that the businesses aren't marginal, that they're really viable, good faith businesses that are meant to do more than just support you and or your immediate family. And it's a marginality test in many instances that can be demonstrated by showing, the good faith nature of the business plan. So I think we'll see more of these visas as we move forward, particularly if there's restrictions on some of the other temporary visa categories that were mentioned as possible avenues by the Trump administration. The other thing that I wanted to mention were the intracompany transferee visas. So the concept here is that you have an existing business abroad and that you're opening a branch, subsidiary, or affiliate office in the United States. So it's not tied to nationality, it's open to any nationality. So we have Chinese companies that open up in the United States and open up a manufacturing branch or what have you. It would allow executives or managers who have worked abroad for a full year for that Chinese company to come to the United States, open an office, and eventually apply for permanent residence if that was the goal without a labor market test. The government does have an antiquated view of what a new office looks like. They want to see bricks and mortars. They want to see lease space. This is not the type of thing you could do if you're running a business from your living room or from your home, even though I appreciate in this environment that's the reality for many businesses. But the government does want to see leases, contracts for IT services, cleaning services, etc. But it's a popular strategy not tied to any nationality, and I think we'll be seeing some more of this. And then finally, on the US side, there is still this concept of extraordinary ability in business. Sorry, the next slide. So if you are in the top 1 to 2% of your field, as defined by meeting at least 3 of the criteria here. So you have awards, you have memberships in organizations of achievement, published material. If you command a high salary, you can get an O1 visa as long as you'll work in your field of extraordinary ability in the United States. And this is approved initially for a 3-year period, but like the e-visa, it can be extended indefinitely. So we have a lot of clients that prefer to be on an O1 when they do not want a green card or do not want citizenship for whatever reason, be it residency or tax. These can be approved in as quick as 15 calendar days when premium processing is available. So certainly for those entrepreneurs or investors who have a paper trail of their achievements and really can document their successes, this continues to be a popular avenue for entrepreneurs and investors, even despite some of these COVID restrictions. And then finally, as it relates to the US, just pivoting really quickly, there are permanent, so these are the green card options available for investors, entrepreneurs, and private clients. And the United States has essentially 5 tiers of green cards. The middle two, EB2 and EB3, those are people that are in the United States. They're usually on H-1Bs, and they require a labor certification. So we're not going to talk about them today, but we will focus on EB1, which is the priority workers. And those essentially would be your L1 or O1 visa holders. So intracompany transferees who are managers abroad, managers in the United States, they can get a green card without a test of the US labor market relatively quickly, depending on nationality. And those L1 and O1 visa petitions can be converted into green card cases relatively quickly once someone gets to the United States. And then of course there's EB5, which is the investor permanent residence program. And I know you had some discussions on it, but what's nice about EB5 is you can invest directly into your own business as long as that business directly employs 10 US workers and it's sustained over the period of the investment. But as a practical matter, the vast majority of investors tend to invest through what's known as the regional center program. And that's really a passive investment program, which allows people to invest in a pre-approved project that will create 10 US jobs either directly or indirectly. And people can leverage that investment to come into the United States and work, start their own business, study, retire, what have you. But many of my clients and the vast majority of people that leverage EB5 like the regional center program because of the passive investment component to it. It's important when you're looking at permanent residence, just changing the slide, to always consider visa backlogs. So here on the left-hand side of the chart, you can see EB1 and EB5. No one country can receive more than 7% of the annual total that is allotted to foreign nationals. So if you're from a country with a high demand of immigration to the United States, mainland China, India, Mexico, the Philippines, Vietnam, there are certain backlogs that are applicable to you and not other citizens of the world. So you can see there's some backlogs for instance, in the EB5 Regional Center program for Chinese, Indian, and Vietnamese citizen. Many of these countries, though, do not have a backlog. So if you're British and you're coming over on an L1 or an O1, as you can see here, the visa numbers are current and available, and you can usually get a green card in about 12 months based on current processing times. Obviously, that will change post-COVID, but relatively quickly. And many of the visa categories that we've discussed today do not have backlogs for most nationalities. So I think we'll continue to see that as some of the other categories usage drops off. And then really just an overview of the EB5 process. I'm not going to cover it much at length, but the idea is that you find an investment, usually through a regional center. you invest the money, you show that you gain the money lawfully, and that investment will prospectively generate the 10 US jobs directly or indirectly. Once it's approved, you apply for that immigrant visa at the consulate abroad if you're living abroad. Again, none of the presidential proclamations banning immigration or suspending it for 60 days would apply. Those cases would continue to be processed under normal course, and you would initially get a green card for 2 years, but eventually you'd have those conditions, that conditional status, removed at the end of the 2-year period once you show that the money was spent in the project and that the jobs were actually created. And again, if you're working through a regional center, you leverage the regional center and their business plan heavily to prove that requirement. But I think we'll see more of this, particularly if there are restrictions in the student and H-1B category, as we discussed at the beginning of the presentation. Pivoting real quick, I know we don't have much time and I want to leave for Q&A. Just to note, the regional center program, is temporary, so it's up for reauthorization in September, and investment thresholds were recently raised. Other global entrepreneurial and investment options that I wanted to cover. Again, I'm a US lawyer based in New York. If you could just turn the slide real quick. So I'm a generalist with these programs, but I do have colleagues, Nadine Goldfoot in London, who is my partner that handles the UK applications and EMEA applications, and I have another partner based in Australia, in Sydney, Teresa Liu, who handles the Australian cases. But I'd be happy to put you in touch with either of them if you have specific questions or interests in the UK or Australia. But I did want to note that the UK Tier 1 investor visa category remains open. You can submit your applications online. There will be delays in adjudication because of COVID, but nevertheless, the program is still open. We've seen a resurgence of interest in this category post-Brexit. You know, a lot of people that were looking to live in the UK or leverage the UK as a jurisdiction may have in the past looked at some of these other European programs. That's going to be problematic post-Brexit. So there's a renewed really interest in the UK Tier 1 investor category that we've seen. It is expensive, particularly compared to the EB5. It's a £2 million threshold. It needs to be invested in an active and trading UK registered company. There are expedites if there are higher investment thresholds. The real issue with the UK Tier 1 for most clients is that there is a pretty strict residence requirement. You have to no absences of 180 days in a 12-month period. And that can be problematic for many investors, potentially if they have obligations around the world. Turning to the next slide. There is also a UK startup and innovator visa that was launched on March 30th. The concept of the startup and innovator visa, particularly the startup, was really to target the student population in the UK. It allows for 2 years of temporary residence. The innovator visa allows up to 3 years of temporary residence, but the innovator visa, unlike the startup, permits indefinite leave to remain eligibility from year 3. For the startup visa, it's really for new entrepreneurs who are opening a new business in the UK. What's attractive about it is that there's no investment, minimum investment amount required. The business idea must be innovative, viable, and scalable. So new, not innovative, not necessarily something that's established or already in the UK market. The innovator visa, there is a minimum investment threshold, but it's only £50,000. Applicants must be endorsed by the UK trusted body. These include seed competitions, business accelerators, and certain government agencies and higher education. But this is a more popular program. These programs tend to be more popular with people that are just graduating in the UK. And again, these applications are still being accepted for submission during COVID. Turning the slide. The only other thing I talked about it needing to be innovative, viable, and scalable. You do need basic language skills requirement. B2 is a high level of English, but most people are studying in the UK and should be able to demonstrate this. The only other thing in the UK that I would mention for investors and entrepreneurs is on the following slide. There is a concept of, a visa for a UK representative of an overseas business. So unlike the US, which for the L1 requires an existing business abroad and potentially opening a new business in the United States, here, if there is no business yet in the UK, but the employee of the overseas company is appointed to establish that business, then it would allow for temporary residence in the United States for 1 to 3 years with a path to indefinite leave to remain in UK citizenship. So you need to have related industry experience, hold a senior position within the company, be able to speak English, but it's a visa category that really allows you to come in and really establish that company in the United States if you have an existing, not States, United Kingdom, if you have an existing business abroad. And then the last jurisdiction that I'm going to cover here is Australia. And Australia, like the United States, has a whole group of visas that are available. On this slide, you can sort of see the percentage breakdown. It's really the business innovation and investor programs that we're going to talk about mostly today. It's really only 6.3% of the applicants into Australia. There are a global talent stream, the employer sponsor programs, as well as the general skilled migration programs. Turning the slide. The Australian Business Talent Visa. This is a permanent visa that allows high caliber business owners with a genuine and realistic commitment to establish or participate in Australian businesses. There must be a substantial ownership interest, and the person must be involved in the management of the business. You do need net assets of 1.5 million Australian dollars transferred to Australia, and the turnover of the overseas business must be at least 3 million Australian dollars out of 2 of the last 4 years. So you can see you have to be by high caliber, a pretty successful business, not only abroad, but in terms of what you're planning in Australia. There's also a venture capital entrepreneur stream. Again, it's for high caliber entrepreneurs who have entered into a legally enforceable agreement with an Australian company, which is a venture capital member of the Australian Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. And you need to receive funding of at least 1 million for an early startup business or the commercialization of a project or development of the expansion of an existing business. Again, there is state approval required, but there is no age limit for this one. So those are 2 permanent visa schemes that are used in Australia, and those continue to be open, although with delays because of some COVID closures. Turning the next slide. Is the business development visa. There's a temporary visa, there's an investor stream and a significant investor stream. The investor stream has a 1.5 Australian million dollar threshold. The significant investor stream has 5 million Australian dollars, and the premium has 15 million, but you can see a much higher investment threshold. So while these programs are popular, you can see there are different thresholds depending on if you're looking to permanently reside in the United States, and or you know, what price point or what is the success of the individual underlying business or investment from a venture capital. So these programs, I think, will continue to be popular, potentially as there, you know, there's an economic downturn in some of these major receiving jurisdictions are attractive place to invest for many of the investors that may have been in emerging markets previously, for instance. So I think it's something we're watching for. We're still seeing interest in these programs, and some of these travel restrictions and exemptions, I think, will have a continued push to use some of these programs for insurance policies, environmental policies, or whatever reason in the future. That's it. Sorry, I rushed there at the end, but I know we're running out of time, Bruno. Can you hear me, Bruno?
Let me do that. I can, Chad. Can you hear me?
I can. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. That's great. Let me just do my techie bit, and let's get to the end. Yeah, questions. So we do have a few questions. I've been rumbling through these as you've been talking. Let me switch on my camera so you can see me. I guess, you know, given that you are based in the US, lots of different options there. It's very clear. You know, like the UK, there are many options to enter the United States and work legally. We heard a couple of weeks ago, I think, that USCIS offices are closed, of course. They're not processing, but they were planned to be open on June the 4th. Is there an update on that situation, or does that advice remain as it was a few weeks ago, Chad?
So again, it's a mixed bag. USCIS was never officially closed. So US consulate offices, you know, closed because of COVID or for a temporary period, but actual USCIS in the regional centers that adjudicate the cases, they never officially closed. So there have been some outages where they've had to close for a few days. So for instance, the Vermont Service Center that adjudicates many of the New York petitions, I believe there was a COVID concern, and for a couple days they were, you know, closing down the facility to mitigate that. But we have, we're still getting cases approved. We're still filing H-1B cases. The government did not relax like the UK, any of the need to file extensions or waive certain requirements. So the position of the US federal government has really been a regional one, that we're continuing to be open. We're seeing delays. They've suspended premium processing, as I mentioned, but the mechanics of the bureaucracy are still moving, albeit really slowly. Where they have taken a harder line is on the in-person stuff. So a lot of times when you get a green card, particularly if you adjust status in the United States, it requires an in-person interview. Those have been rescheduled. So they're trying to, you know, limit the amount of in-person interface that's required. And so we'll see delays there. But otherwise, we're still filing with the service center, and we really never had an official closure like I think you've seen in the UK and some other jurisdictions.
Yeah, and that's pretty much just a similar story. There have been closures in the UK as well. We're seeing some reopenings slowly, but in-person interviews, they're a little bit standoffish. People are very wary of that. They're waiting for further instructions from government. But staying with our friend COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, in your experience in the last few weeks, I guess since March, what have been the most popular programs that people have been coming to you, Chad, in New York, as Frank, and asking you for more information? Has there been a seismic shift in people's strategies to immigration, or really have they said, oh well, we're just continuing with the way we were?
I think it's too early to conclusively say. I do think, though, that the discussions and the interest in residence and citizenship is different now. So previously, people's tax tolerance and tax concerns were a major motivating factor in terms of their visa strategy. And in many instances, they would not want a green card in the United States or citizenship in the United States because of worldwide taxation issues. I'm not a tax lawyer, but just generally that's the feedback. I think now that risk assessment for them has changed a bit because there are so many advantages and exemptions for residency and citizenship, and that's become more apparent to people, I think, because of all the border closures and new rules that have popped up. So what I'm seeing is a renewed interest in, okay, I've been thinking about permanent residency, now I'm ready to move, or they've kind of changed their risk assessment and are maybe not as concerned about the tax issues and want some more permanency or predictability in their immigration status. Does that answer your question?
I think, yeah, it does, in fact. Look, we're running a little bit over time, but I want to address one more issue that came through the wires here. And it's one that's been, it's being talked about. We've seen Senate committee hearings on this, and this is it's a political question. According to one of our viewers, and I wasn't aware of this on this occasion, on May the 7th, 4 Republican senators sent a letter asking for the suspension of the EB-5 program and other employment-based immigration categories until unemployment has returned to normal levels. Now, what is a normal level? We're not going to go into the definition of that. What's interesting, though, and the viewer is asking, why do they have this position? Now, in part, I can say that there is Senator Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, Chuck Grassley, and Josh Hawley. Certainly, in the case of Cruz and particularly Grassley, we know he's a fervent anti EB-5 program senator. And he often talks about the issues around EB-5 and gerrymandering, doesn't he? What is the motivation for Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley to get behind and support Grassley and Cruz on this, in your opinion? And I realize I may be putting you slightly out of what is your normal 9 to 5, Chad.
So my understanding was that, and I'm not certainly the expert at my firm on this issue, but my understanding was that that letter was in response to the initial presidential proclamation and that directive to study the temporary visa issues and potential further restrictions. So I think that letter was in response to that initial presidential proclamation and to advocate for further restrictions in those areas. I do think on the left and the right, particularly the more populist wings of both parties, that there is a perception that many of these programs take away opportunities for US workers. And there's just a general disposition against all immigration, not just EB-5, but primarily the H-1Bs, the students, the spousal work authorizations. So I think that's where it's coming from, that they see this as an opportunity to really make the case that, not just EB-5, but most immigration should be suspended, unrelated to, even pandemic presents an opportunity to do it through existing regulation. But even before this, I don't think there was a lot of enthusiasm from that wing of the party for these types of immigration programs, even if they are the best and the brightest. Right. I think Grassley's original concern, as I understood it, was that too much of the EB-5 money was going to urban states and urban projects and New York City developers, et cetera. And some of the regulatory changes that we saw in the fall and the advantages that now are available to rural projects given investment amounts, that might change the calculation for some of these rural senators. But I think on both sides, they see, some of the populist wings of both parties see this as an opportunity to stop immigration generally, or try to stop so it's less about EB-5 and more about the entire immigration system.
All right. Okay. Thanks. I think that's quite clear. Actually, it's good to have these updates, given that you're right there in New York City. Look, we're running over, so we're going to have to close off today's broadcast.
A little late with the technical issues.
Absolutely, no problem at all. For our viewers, if you do have more questions, feel free to get in touch with Chad through Fragomen. Chad, you're on LinkedIn. I think you're probably on Twitter as well. If nobody has Chad's email address, please write to us at the Secretariat and we'll happily provide introductions. I hope that the audience at home enjoyed and found today's session very interesting, as much as I did. If you are not already a member of the IMC, then please open and save the handouts that are located in the GoToWebinar widget, which is on the right of your screen. We will be back next Wednesday, the 20th of May, again at 2:30 Central European Summertime. And there I'll be talking about COVID-19, but this time we'll move down to the Caribbean. And there I'm delighted to say that I'll be joined by Dr. Mario Gutierrez, who's the macroeconomic advisor for the IMF in Dominica, and we'll be talking about the economics of what's happening in that region. We'll also have a number of senior level representatives from Antigua and Barbuda, from the government of St. Kitts, St. Lucia, and Grenada. So please go to our website and register if you haven't already done so. I think this will be a very interesting session, because there's quite a lot happening in the Caribbean as they look for new sources of income and redeveloping the programs that they already have. In the meantime, I think the saying now, Chad, is stay safe, stay home, and stay sanitized. You can. But it's been very good to have you with us, Chad. I very much appreciate the time you've taken from your busy agenda advising your clients. Have a very good day ahead if you're in the Americas, and a very good night if you're in the Middle East and Asia. And I will see you next Wednesday. Stay logged in, because we're just going to play the short IMC education and training video. So bye-bye for now. Bye, Chad.
Introducing the Certification in Investment Migration from the Investment Migration Council, the first structured learning product of its kind globally, designed for you. Explore the bite-sized learning pathway of each module on our custom online platform. You can track your progress as you go, and learn at a pace that suits you, with an estimated 5 hours of study time per module. The certification in investment migration contributes to the development of professional competencies and standards for those new to or already working in the industry. So, what are you waiting for? Visit our website to start your learning journey today.